Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I am so happy that you are joining us for my Gingham Quilt sew-along. This is video number 5, which is my final installment in this series. If this is something that you are interested in doing, you can go back and check out the playlist to see videos 1 through 4. And don't worry, we'll wait for you right here. Okay, now let's talk about the final step in building our quilt top. We're going to take those blocks that we sewed in our last video, which should look something like this. Now, it doesn't matter whether it looks like this, this, or this, as long as your block follows 2 rules. Rule number 1 is that your medium fabrics must be in opposite corners. And rule number 2 is that your dark and light fabrics must be in opposite corners. As long as those 2 conditions are met, your block is good to go. Now let's talk about block size a little bit. If you were able to figure out how to do a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance, and remember, I did not teach you how to do that because I wanted you to be consistent with your seam allowance. But if you did so with a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowances, your blocks right now in their current state should measure at about 10.5 inches. That's right, 10.5 inches. Sorry, I had to do the math in my head too. Sometimes it messes me up. When you sew all of these 10.5 inch blocks together, then your finished block size, meaning that all 4 sides of your block have been sewn into the quilt top, would measure at about 10 inches. Now, the only reason why we're talking about block size is because I want you to get an idea for how big, how much space each of those blocks are going to take up in your quilt top, because the next thing we're going to do is figure out how many rows and columns we need. Now, because I didn't tell you an exact number of blocks to make, and I'm assuming that you guys are going to tailor this a little bit for your own needs, everybody here could have a different number of blocks. So take a moment just to pause the video and go count your blocks. It's important that you know before we move into this next step exactly how many blocks you have to work with. For me, I have 60, which is going to be a little less than what I need. So thankfully, I have some extra scrap fabric, and I'm going to take my time to create just 3 more because I want 63 for my full quilt top. I could make 60 work, but again, remember, I'm trying to make this queen size, and I want to make sure I have that nice drape on either side of my bed. So I'm going to take the time just to invest in a few more blocks so that I can get this to the size that I really want it to be. You're welcome to do that too if you have extra fabric. If you don't, make it work. It'll be fine. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Before we even start sewing, we need to just sit down and think and plan this out. I've got 63 blocks, so we're going to work with my number, but you can figure your number in here if it's easier for you. Since these blocks are going to finish at 10 inches, the math here is really pretty easy. All you're going to do is figure out how wide and how long do you want the quilt to be. So for a good throw size blanket, you're probably looking at somewhere around 40 inches wide by 60 inches long. That is a good throw size blanket, but it can be adjusted any way you need it to be. So if you need it to be 40 inches wide, how many 10-inch blocks do you need? If you said 4, you got it, because 40 inches divided by 10 inches, which is the size of your finished block, is 4. So to make a quilt that is 40 inches wide, each of your rows needs to be 4 deep. And then you do the same thing for the length. If you want it to be 60 inches long, how many of those rows do you need? If those rows measure 10 inches high by 40 inches wide, how many do you need? 60 inches divided by 10 inches is 6. So you would need 6 rows of 4. For me, with my 63, I'm going to have 7 blocks across and 9 rows down. Does that make sense? 9 times 7 is 63, right? I think it is. Hope it is. So now that you've got the math piece figured out, make sure that the number across times the number of rows down. So for example, with our 4 across and our 6 down, multiply those 2 numbers together. So 4 times 6 is 24. If you have 24 of these blocks, you're going to be able to make a good throw size blanket. Now, don't worry. If you have a few extra, you can always add another block to the width of your quilt or another row to the bottom. It's going to be fine. If you don't have enough to do another column or another row, then you can always use it to make a cute little pillow sham or a throw pillow or something else. Or you can just hold on to it for a scrappy quilt that you can do later. Okay, we've got all the hard stuff done. We don't need to think anymore. Now we just need to lay stuff out. And this is the part where the magic of what this quilt is going to give you is going to come through. We're going to take our blocks and we're going to make rows, and we're just going to keep making all the rows that we need. So if you're making the throw size and you've got 24 blocks, you're going to make 6 rows of 4. And when you do that, you need to make sure that your blocks are laid out in a specific way. So I'm going to turn the camera around and show you down on my table what we're going to do. Okay, so my blocks are going to be a little too big to fit all of them in frame, but I want to give you an idea of what we're going to do. For each of our rows, we're going to sew them so that we have our blocks looking like this. We're going to have our dark block in the upper left-hand corner, and then our light block in the lower right-hand corner, and then we're going to sew it next to another block that is laid the exact same way. You're going to make all of your rows looking like this. So remember, if you're going to make a row that consists of 4 blocks, you're going to sew these together, add another one over here, and then another one to that one, and then you have a row. You're going to press all your seams and then make another row. And once you have each of your rows, then we're going to sew those rows together. So the first thing that I'm going to do is go to the machine, and I'm going to sew a row of 7. So I've got 2 here, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And I'm going to keep them organized like this so my dark fabric is in the upper left-hand corner. So I know that my seam is always going to be along this side. This side is going to be sewn to this side of the previous block. Okay, so here's our first row all put together, and it is just basically the same pattern over and over and over again. And so that's what your row should look like. Go to your sewing machine, make all of the rows that you need, and then we'll come back together and I will show you how to sew each of these rows together. You're not going to really see this pattern come out until you get a couple of rows assembled together, and then you're going to see what it looks like. Okay, now all of your rows should be sewn together, and it is time to sew each of your rows to one another. So I have 2 rows here all pinned together, but before we get started with that, I just want to kind of walk you through this a little bit, especially for those of you that are beginner sewers. When you are sewing your blocks into individual rows, I don't know if you took the time to pin. I did not, and that is okay. But now that we're going to sew very long rows onto one another, it's going to be worth it to take the time to pin these rows together because the fabrics are so long. And so when we're pinning, we're going to look wherever we have a seam, and we're going to pin every single seam. Now you could just pin the seam where the block is, so you would skip one, pin one, skip one, pin one, and repeat that pattern down. But it doesn't take that much longer to pin if these extra seams. If you're going to pin already, it's worth it just to do it every 5 inches. So you would do every single seam, and that's going to guarantee that all of your points line up pretty good. Let me show you what I mean by that. Okay, and here is my row that I finished, and this is the other row that I finished, and they're pinned together. This quilt top is very forgiving, but what you're really going to be looking for are points that look something like this. You want to see, when you're very, very close up, that all 4 of these fabrics kind of come together in one circle, one main point. You don't want any of them to be overlapping. So I wouldn't want the gray to bleed over to here, or the white to bleed over to here, vice versa. I wouldn't want the black or the dark gray to bleed over here, or this gray to bleed over here. I want them all to meet in one central point. That's what's going to make this look crisp and clean and perfect. This is another example of a point like that, but if you look very, very closely, I don't know if you can see it on camera, I can definitely see it in person. This point is not perfect because my gray, my dark gray, comes over and touches that white just ever so slightly. But you know what? That's only up close that you see that. I just got pricked by a pin. That's only up close that you see that. If I take a step back and I lay it down, you don't really see that that point isn't perfect. That's what I want to show you here. When you're sewing these, aim to get them as close as possible, but be a little forgiving on yourself. If the points are not exactly perfect, by the time you get this whole thing assembled, you get it quilted, you put it in the wash, you bind it, and you snuggle up against it, you're not going to notice little imperfections like this. Now, you might notice if your fabrics are grossly over. So if this gray came down, let's say 1/4 of an inch, or maybe even further, you're going to obviously notice that. But anything that is just a little bit, you're not going to notice that at the end of the day. So the closer you can get these to being perfect, the better. And that's where the pinning comes in. So this is what I did to pin. I started with one end of my fabric. I'm just going to scooch this out of the way so you can see. I started with one end of my fabric and I pinned this end. And then every time I came to a seam, I nested the seam and I put the pin in through one side of it and I brought it back up through the other side. Now, when I was doing this, I did find some seams where the seam for the fabric was going in the same direction, and that's okay. So I just laid them on top of each other and made sure that it looked like the fabrics were going to match up nicely. You could also just take your thumb and your forefinger and fold one of the seams in the opposite direction so that they nest. When you do that, after you've done it, you'll have a wrinkled seam here. So if I were to do like this, right, if I wanted to pin it this way, because, well, this is a bad example. Let me show you down here. So if I wanted to do that like down here, if I pinned it this way, this is sewn, so the seam is going this way. So in that case, all you'd want to do, if you sewed it like this so that it's twisted, you can just press that really flat and it'll be fine. Or if that bothers you, and it shouldn't because it's seams that are going to be hidden inside a quilt, you can just take your scissors and just snip right up to that line, but don't cut into your thread. And then that'll let you lay the entire seam in one direction. Again, this quilt is very, very forgiving. If you have some twisted seams, I can tell you I'm going to. You can fix them if you want to, but it is not necessary. I will tell you, I am not fixing them. And in fact, if I have seams where I can't turn the fabric and make them butt up against one another, I'm actually just going to lay them perfectly on top of each other so that the folds are lined up in my little sandwich there, and I'm going to pin that in place and sew it. All right, so I have taken the time to pin this entire length, and it just keeps coming. I've got 7 of these blocks, so this is 70 inches of fabric when it will be all sewn together. Now I'm going to take this to my machine and I'm going to sew along my pinned edge at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, because that's what I did everything else at, is 1/4 inch. Whatever you chose to use to line up your seam, you're going to follow that same seam allowance because that's going to make your square. If you're taking an even and consistent seam along all 4 sides, it's going to shrink that fabric in the same amount on each side, so it's going to keep that square shape. The only thing that I want to show you when you're sewing, when you do this, as your foot approaches the pin, right as you get close to that pin, you're going to stop sewing and pull that pin out and then resume and then sew on. And then when you get to the next pin, you're going to stop and pull that out. A lot of people do sew over pins, but you don't want to do that because you can cause damage to your machine. It's not something that'll happen every single time, which is why people, I feel like, think that it's safe to sew over pins, because you don't frequently hit the pin. But if you do hit the pin, you will break a needle, you could damage your machine, you could break the pin, and if any of this stuff gets broken and goes flying, it's not worth the risk to me, because I don't want this to end up in my foot one day. All right, so I'm going to take it over here and go sew.
So there is my finished quilt top. It is all done. I'm probably going to add some borders to this just to give it a little bit more length and make it a little bit more dramatic. I love how this is turning out, and you can really see how that gingham pattern is starting to pop. It's the contrast of the medium gray and that dark gray that's really setting it off. So I think the only thing left to do is to show my husband. Let's calm down here and see what he thinks. Okay, open your eyes. What do you think?
That's nice. That's big.
Right? And it's not done yet because I'm going to add a little bit more to it. I'm going to add some borders so it'll fit our queen size bed nicely and drape over the sides.
All right. That's pretty good.
2 thumbs up. 2 thumbs up. You like the color scale?
Yeah. Like I said before, it'd look weird if it was small. It's okay that it's big.
You like it because it looks big.
Well, this pattern.
Or because the pattern's
pattern,
big.
Yeah.
So we are all done. This series is ended. Hubby's happy with his quilt top. We're going to add some borders to it, and I'm going to send it off to be quilted. You're okay if I don't quilt it, right?
That's fine.
That's fine. Thank you for joining us for this quilt series. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Give me a thumbs up. I will be doing more quilt alongs like this. So if this is something that you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you guys all in the next video.